Dr. Amanda Foster pressed her face against the cold glass of the observation deck and watched the stars twist in patterns that should not exist. The Luna Base 7 Observatory had been her home for 3 years now, and every single day brought new readings that made her stomach turn with worry. The quantum resonance detector behind her hummed with data that the Galactic Council refused to believe. She walked back to her workstation and pulled up the latest measurements on her screen. The numbers glowed bright red against the dark background, and each reading was worse than the last. Space itself was bending near the edge of known territory, and something massive was pushing through from another dimension. Amanda had sent 47 reports to the Council, and 47 times they had marked her findings as human paranoia. The door to the observatory slid open with a soft hiss, and Captain Jake Morrison stepped inside. His uniform was wrinkled from the long flight from Earth, and his face showed the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting bureaucrats for months. He looked at Amanda and shook his head before she could even ask about his latest meeting with the military committee. They said no again, Jake told her as he walked over to look at her data. Admiral Lisa Hayes tried to back us up, but the committee thinks we are seeing ghosts where none exist. The Zephyrian representative actually laughed when I showed them your readings. Amanda felt her heart sink as she watched Jake study the quantum signatures on her screen. The patterns were getting stronger each day, and soon they would reach a critical point where whatever was trying to break through would succeed. She had calculated that they had maybe 6 months before the dimensional barrier collapsed completely. "What about the mining colonies?" Amanda asked. "Surely they must be seeing something strange by now." Jake nodded and pulled up a communication, linked to Kepler 442b. The signal took several minutes to connect across the vast distance, but eventually the tired face of Carl Johnson appeared on the screen. The mining foreman looked like he had not slept in weeks, and his eyes kept darting around as if he expected something to jump out at him. "Carl, any new developments on your end?" Jake asked. Carl rubbed his beard and looked uncomfortable. "The quantum extractors have been acting up for 2 weeks now. Random power spikes, energy readings that make no sense, and the worst part is the dreams. Half my crew is having the same nightmare every night. We see these black shapes moving between the stars and consuming entire worlds." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. The dreams were a sign that the dimensional barrier was already starting to leak. Whatever was on the other side was so powerful that its presence could affect human minds across light years of space. "Have you reported this to Colonial Administration?" Jake asked. Carl laughed bitterly. 3 times. "They keep telling me it's equipment malfunction and stress from working in deep space. They filed my reports under maintenance issues and sent me a technician who spent 2 days telling me the machines were working perfectly." The communication link cut out, and Amanda and Jake were left staring at a blank screen. The mining colonies were the closest human settlements to the dimensional weak point, and if they were already experiencing effects, then time was running out faster than Amanda had predicted. Jake activated his personal communicator and tried to reach Admiral Hayes back on Earth. The signal bounced through several relay stations before connecting to the Earth Defense Fleet headquarters. Lisa Hayes appeared on screen looking frustrated and tired from her own battles with the military bureaucracy. "Any luck with the Council?" Jake asked. Lisa shook her head. "The Zephyrian ambassador Kethvar gave a speech yesterday about humanity's persistent fear-mongering and how we see threats in every shadow. The other species representatives agreed completely. They think we are still traumatized from our early days of space exploration when we were afraid of everything." Amanda walked over to the communicator and looked directly at Admiral Hayes. "Ma'am, with respect, My readings show we have maybe 4 months before the barrier fails completely. When that happens, whatever is on the other side will pour into our dimension, and every inhabited world in this galaxy will be at risk. Admiral Hayes studied Amanda's face through the screen and seemed to see the genuine fear there. Doctor, I believe you. The problem is that the Galactic Council controls military resources, and they won't authorize any defensive preparations based on what they call human hysteria. The 3 humans sat in silence for a moment, each understanding that they were completely alone in their knowledge of the coming disaster. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had dismissed their warnings and left humanity to face the unknown threat without support. What if we prepare on our own? Jake suggested. The Earth Defense Fleet has some resources, and we could at least get our own colonies ready for evacuation. Admiral Hayes considered this. Unauthorized military preparations could get us expelled from the Galactic Council entirely. We would lose access to their technology and trade networks. Earth's economy would collapse within a year. Amanda turned back to her instruments and watched the quantum readings spike again. Whatever was trying to break through was getting stronger and more determined. The patterns reminded her of something alive and intelligent, as if some vast mind was studying the barrier between dimensions and learning how to tear it apart. "Look at this!" Amanda called out, and Jake and Admiral Hayes both focused on her screen. The quantum signature had changed into something that looked almost like a heartbeat. Regular pulses of energy were probing the dimensional wall, and each pulse was slightly different from the last, as if testing for weaknesses. "It's learning," Amanda whispered. "Whatever this thing is, it's intelligent and it's figuring out how to break through." The observation deck suddenly filled with an alarm sound as Amanda's equipment detected a massive energy surge from the edge of space. All 3 humans watched as the quantum readings spiked higher than they had ever seen before. For a moment, reality itself seemed to flicker, and Amanda could swear she saw shapes moving in the darkness between stars. Then everything went back to normal, and the readings dropped to their previous levels. But Amanda knew that what they had just witnessed was a test. Something enormous and hostile had just pushed against the dimensional barrier with enough force to make space itself shake. Admiral Hayes closed the communication link without another. Word and Amanda knew she was already planning how to quietly mobilize Earth's defenses without alerting the Galactic Council. Jake stood at the observation window, staring out at the stars and trying to imagine what kind of enemy humanity was about to face. Amanda returned to her workstation and began composing another report to the Galactic Council. She knew it would be dismissed like all the others, but she had to keep trying until the very end. The readings on her screen showed that the dimensional barrier was weakening faster now, and she estimated they had maybe 3 months left before it failed completely. As she typed her warning about the impending invasion, Amanda wondered if humanity's reputation for paranoia would be the thing that destroyed them all. The galaxy's older and supposedly wiser civilizations had convinced themselves that humans saw threats where none existed. Soon, they would all learn that sometimes the paranoid species is the only one that survives. The dimensional barrier shattered like glass hitting concrete, and reality screamed as something ancient and hungry poured through the gap. Dr. Amanda Foster watched her instruments explode with readings that should have been impossible, while alarms shrieked throughout Luna Base 7. The quantum breach had opened 3 weeks ahead of her most pessimistic calculations, and now darkness was spilling into normal space like oil spreading across water. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched the outer colonies disappear. from his tactical display one by one. Each blinking light represented millions of lives, and every few minutes another one simply vanished without even a distress signal. The communication channels filled with static and then went silent as something consumed the relay stations between stars. On Kepler 442b, Foreman Carl Johnson gathered his mining crew in the main shelter and tried to keep them calm while the world outside went insane. The quantum extractors had overloaded and exploded, sending pillars of unnatural fire into the sky. Through the reinforced windows, Carl could see shapes moving between dimensions, like sharks swimming through the air. The shapes were wrong in ways that hurt to look at, and seemed to exist in more directions than the human mind could process. "Stay away from the windows!" Carl shouted over the sound of reality tearing itself apart outside. "Don't look directly at those things and keep the children in the center of the room." The mining families huddled together while their world died around them. The shapes outside grew larger and more solid as they fed on the energy of the colony. First the power grid failed, then the life support systems, and finally the very ground. Beneath their feet began to dissolve as the entities consumed the fundamental forces that held matter together. Carl activated the emergency beacon and sent out a final transmission before the communication array melted into nothing. "This is Kepler 442b to any human vessel. We are under attack by unknown entities that consume energy itself. The colony is lost. Warn Earth. Warn everyone." The current signal raced across space at light speed while the colony that sent it ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The mining families simply faded from reality as the entities absorbed everything that made them real. Within hours, Kepler 442b became nothing more than empty space with not even debris to mark where a world had once existed. Admiral Lisa Hayes received Carl's final message while she was in an emergency meeting with Earth Defense Fleet commanders. The communication crackled with interference from the dimensional breach, but the terror in Carl's voice came through clearly. Around the table, hardened military officers went pale as they realized that Amanda Foster's warnings had been completely accurate. "How many colonies do we have in the outer sectors?" Admiral Hayes asked. Commander Ben Carter consulted his tactical display. 37 settlements with a total population of 12 million. We're losing contact with them in order of their distance from the breach point. Admiral Hayes stood and walked to the main screen, where she could see the galaxy-wide communication network collapsing. Red zones spread across the star map like a plague as entire systems went dark. The Galactic Council's own monitoring stations were failing as something consumed the technology that had taken thousands of years to build. "What about our fleet?" Admiral Hayes asked. "How many ships can we mobilize without Council authorization?" "Commander." Carter's fingers danced across his control panel as he accessed classified fleet positions. "We have 43 vessels within range of the outer colonies. Most are patrol ships and cargo haulers, but USS Defiance is a full battle cruiser, and she's already moving to intercept." On the bridge of USS Defiance, Captain Morrison watched his tactical officer try to make sense of the sensor readings from the breach zone. The instruments showed massive objects moving through space, but the shapes changed every time they looked at them. It was as if the entities existed in a state of constant flux, shifting between dimensions in ways that made tracking them impossible. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from Dr. Foster on Luna Base 7, his communications officer reported. Amanda's face appeared on the main screen, and Morrison could see the fear in her eyes, even across the vast distance. Behind her, the observatory's instruments sparked and smoked as they overloaded from the dimensional energies pouring through space. "Captain, I've been analyzing the entity's behavior patterns," Amanda said quickly. They're not just destroying things randomly. They seem to feed on organized energy patterns, especially complex structures like cities and starships. The more advanced the technology, the more attractive it is to them. Morrison felt his blood run cold as he realized what that meant. "Doctor, are you saying these things are drawn to civilization itself?" Amanda nodded grimly. "They consume order and leave chaos behind. Every planet they've hit has been completely sterilized, not just of life, but of any organized matter. They're turning inhabited worlds back into clouds of random particles. The communication link filled with static as another wave of dimensional energy swept across the galaxy. When the signal cleared, Amanda was gone, and Luna Base 7 had joined the growing list of installations that no longer existed. Commander. Carter pulled his ship out of hyperspace near the last known position of Kepler 442b and found nothing but empty space where a planet should have been. His instruments detected no debris, no radiation, no trace that a world had ever existed in this location. It was as if the entities had erased not just the planet, but the very memory of its existence from reality itself. "Captain Morrison, this is Carter," he transmitted across the tactical network. "Kepler 442b is gone, completely gone. There's nothing here but vacuum and background radiation." Morrison stared at his own tactical display and watched 3 more colonies blink out of existence while Carter's message was still transmitting. The entities were moving faster now, spreading through inhabited space like a fire consuming dry wood. Each world they devoured seemed to make them stronger and more aggressive. Admiral Hayes stood in the Earth Defense Fleet Command Center and made the hardest decision of her career. Around her, staff officers waited for orders while reports of devastation poured in from across the galaxy. The Galactic Council had finally acknowledged the threat, but their response was pure panic with no coordination or strategy. "Activate Emergency Protocol 7, Admiral Hayes commanded. "Recall all human vessels to defensive positions around Earth and our core colonies. Prepare for total evacuation of the outer settlements." Her staff officers began implementing the emergency protocols that had been planned for the worst-case scenario of galactic war. Fleet elements began converging on key human worlds, while evacuation ships rushed to collect refugees from the advancing darkness. The Zephyrian homeworld vanished from the galactic communication network, while Ambassador Keth Var was in the middle of transmitting a desperate plea for help. His crystalline features showed absolute terror as he realized that his species' advanced technology was useless against entities that consumed the very concepts of energy and order. "This is Ambassador Keth Var to any vessel that can hear this. Transmission." His final message began. "Our homeworld is under attack by beings that exist outside normal space. Our weapons cannot touch them, and our shields provide no protection. They are consuming our cities, and our people simply fade away. Please remember us. Please remember that we existed." The signal cut to static, and another advanced civilization joined the growing list of species that had been erased from existence. Across the galaxy, the surviving members of the Galactic Council fled their homeworlds as the entities spread like a cancer through space. Captain Morrison received new orders from Admiral Hayes while his ship raced toward Earth at maximum speed. The message was brief and terrifying in its implications. "All human vessels are to fall back to Sol System immediately. We are implementing Plan Omega. Prepare for the defense of Earth itself." Morrison knew that Plan Omega was the absolute last resort, designed for the scenario where humanity faced complete extinction. As his ship jumped to hyperspace, he wondered if the human race would survive long enough to implement whatever desperate strategy Admiral Hayes had in mind. While galactic civilization burned around them, humanity did what it had always done when faced with impossible odds. They adapted, they improvised, and they refused to give up even when logic said they should. Engineer Danny Clark stood in the abandoned shipyards of Mars and looked at the collection of civilian vessels that would have to become humanity's last fleet. The shipyard had been scheduled for decommissioning before the invasion began, and most of the advanced equipment had been sold off or transferred to newer facilities. What remained was a mixture of old cargo haulers, mining ships, and pleasure craft that had been left behind because they were too outdated to be worth moving. Danny smiled grimly as he realized that being outdated might be exactly what humanity needed. "The problem with our modern ships is that they're too complex," Danny explained to his team of volunteer engineers. "These entities seem to be drawn to advanced technology and organized energy patterns. But these old ships run on simple fusion reactors and basic computer systems. They might be invisible to whatever hunting methods these things use." Captain Jake Morrison walked through the retrofitting bay and watched Danny's team install experimental weapons systems into the cargo hold of a 40-year-old freighter. The weapon itself was based on Dr. Amanda Foster's final research notes, which had been transmitted to Earth just before Luna Base 7 was consumed. Instead of trying to destroy the entities directly, the weapon was designed to disrupt their connection to normal space. "How does it work?" Morrison asked as he examined the strange device that looked more like a sculpture than a weapon. Danny wiped grease from his hands and pointed to the crystalline core at the center of the device. Amanda's theory was that these entities exist partially in our dimension and partially in their home dimension. The weapon creates a field of quantum static that forces them to choose one dimension or the other. If they retreat to their home dimension, they can't affect our reality. If they stay in our dimension, they become vulnerable to conventional weapons. Morrison nodded and moved on to examine the next ship in the conversion line. The New Horizon had been a luxury passenger liner before the invasion, and now it was being converted into his flagship. The ship's elegant dining halls were being filled with weapon systems, and the observation decks were being armored against dimensional attacks. The crew of New Horizon was unlike any military unit Morrison had ever commanded. They were volunteers from across human space who had answered the call when Admiral Hayes broadcast her recruitment message. Former cargo pilots worked alongside retired military officers, while mining engineers taught starship mechanics how to modify fusion reactors for combat operations. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone stood in what had once been the ship's ballroom and coordinated the installation of Amanda Foster's dimensional research equipment. The elegant space was now filled with quantum resonance detectors and dimensional anchor points that would hopefully keep the ship stable during combat in twisted space. "Captain, we're receiving volunteers from some unexpected sources," Rachel reported as Morrison joined her. "3 ships full of former pirates just arrived from the Outer Rim. Their leader says they want to kill the things that are killing everything." Morrison looked out through the ballroom's massive windows at the collection of modified ships gathering around Mars. Sleek corporate vessels floated next to battered mining haulers while military patrol ships formed up with converted pleasure craft. It was the most unlikely fleet in human history, but it might be the last fleet humanity would ever assemble. On Earth, General Patricia Wells coordinated the largest evacuation and manufacturing effort in human history. Unlike the other galactic civilizations that relied on centralized production facilities, humanity had always favored distributed manufacturing. This meant that when the entities consumed the major industrial worlds, humans could still produce weapons and supplies from thousands of smaller facilities scattered across their territory. The entities seemed to target high-energy signatures first, General Wells explained to her staff. Large cities, major industrial centers, and military bases are consumed before smaller settlements. This gives us an advantage because human civilization has always been more spread out than other species. The evacuation ships streamed toward Earth's inner colonies, while factory complexes on dozens of worlds worked around the clock to produce the experimental weapons and defensive systems that might give humanity a fighting chance. The production lines that had once made consumer goods were retooled to manufacture dimensional disruptors and quantum anchor points. In the Outer Rim, Squadron Leader Tony Garcia led the first successful counterattack against the entities using a tactic that no military academy would have taught. His squadron of converted mining ships projected false energy signatures that looked like major population centers to the entity's senses. When the creatures moved in to feed, they found themselves surrounded by Amanda Foster's experimental containment fields. It worked, Garcia transmitted to the Fleet Command. We caught one of the smaller entities in the quantum trap. It's struggling, but it can't break free from the containment field. We need a science team out here to study this thing. The captured entity writhed inside the containment field like a living shadow trying to escape from a bottle. Garcia's pilots kept their distance as the creature shifted between dimensions, sometimes appearing as a solid mass of darkness and sometimes flickering in and out of existence like a badly tuned hologram. Captain Morrison received Garcia's transmission, while New Horizon was completing its final systems checks. The news that they had actually captured one of the entities alive sent a wave of excitement through the fleet. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity had something that resembled hope. "Prepare for departure," Morrison announced to his crew. "We're moving to Garcia's position to collect our prisoner. Maybe this thing can tell us how to hurt its friends." The human fleet began moving through space using navigation methods that would have horrified the Galactic Council's safety inspectors. Instead of following established hyperspace lanes, the ships jumped through random coordinates and used irregular flight patterns that made their movements unpredictable. The chaos that other species had always criticized about human behavior was becoming their greatest weapon. Admiral Hayes watched the fleet depart from her command center on Luna and felt a mixture of pride and terror. The ships under Morrison's command represented humanity's last hope for survival, but they were flying into a war zone where the rules of physics themselves had become unreliable. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission from the surviving Galactic Council members," her communications officer reported. "They're requesting sanctuary in human space." Admiral Hayes considered this request for a moment. The same alien officials who had dismissed human warnings were now asking for protection from the very threat they had refused to acknowledge. Part of her wanted to turn them away, but she knew that humanity would need all the allies it could get. "Grant them permission to enter our space," Admiral Hayes decided. "But make it clear that any council ship that enters human territory will follow human commands and human strategy. We don't have time for diplomatic protocols anymore." The refugee ships from a dozen different species began arriving in human space, and their crews got their first look at humanity's approach to the crisis. Instead of panic and despair, they found organized chaos and determined preparation. Human engineers worked alongside alien scientists to modify ship systems, while human military officers planned attacks that relied on unpredictability rather than superior firepower. Ambassador Keth Var, one of the few Zephyrian survivors, stood on the observation deck of a human refugee ship and watched the defensive preparations around Earth. The humans were using tactics and technologies that violated every principle of proper military strategy, but somehow their chaotic approach seemed to be working. "Your species fascinates me," Keth Var said to the human officer escorting him. "Every other civilization in the galaxy has tried to fight these entities with logic and advanced technology. Only humans have succeeded in actually capturing one." The Mino human officer smiled grimly. "Sir, the thing about humans is that we're too stupid to know when we're supposed to lose. We just keep fighting until either we win or there's nothing left to fight with." The captured entity became humanity's window into a realm of existence that should not have been possible to understand. Dr. Rachel Stone stood before the containment field on board New Horizon and watched the creature shift between states of being that hurt to observe directly. The thing inside the quantum trap was simultaneously solid and gaseous, dark and bright, present and absent in ways that made her instruments scream with contradictory readings. "It's not really a single creature," Rachel explained to Captain Morrison as they studied the alien prisoner. "The entity exists in a state of quantum uncertainty where it's many things at once until something forces it to choose a specific form. That's why our weapons couldn't touch them before. How do you shoot something that might not even exist in the same dimension as your bullets?" Morrison stared at the writhing mass of impossibility and tried to understand what they were dealing with. The creature seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, and occasionally he could swear he saw faces forming in the darkness before dissolving back into chaos. "Can it communicate?" Rachel activated a series of instruments that had been cobbled together from Amanda Foster's research notes and the captured alien technology they had acquired from refugee ships. The readings showed patterns of activity that suggested intelligence, but the patterns were unlike anything in human or alien databases. "It's trying to understand us just as much as we're trying to understand it," Rachel said with wonder in her voice. "Look at these neural resonance patterns. The entity is studying our brain waves and learning how we think. It's curious about us. This revelation changed everything about humanity's understanding of the invasion. The entities weren't mindless destroyers, but intelligent beings that consumed civilizations as a way of learning about them. Each world they devoured added to their knowledge and made them more effective at hunting the next target." Captain Ben Carter arrived at New Horizon's position commanding a ship that should not have been able to exist. The Persistence had been built using hybrid human and alien technology powered by contained dimensional rifts that allowed it to exist partially in normal space and partially in the entity's home dimension. The experimental vessel flickered in and out of visibility as it maintained its impossible existence. "Morrison, this is Carter," came the transmission from the ghost ship. "We've tested the dimensional drive and it works. We can follow these things back to their home reality and hit them where they live. The question is whether we're crazy enough to actually do it." Morrison looked at the captured entity and then at the readings showing hundreds more creatures spreading through the galaxy like a plague. The answer to Carter's question was obvious. Humanity had always been crazy enough to try the impossible when survival was at stake. "Prepare for dimensional transition," Morrison ordered his crew. "We're going to pay our uninvited guests a visit in their own neighborhood." Admiral Hayes coordinated the massive undertaking from her command center on Luna while watching human and alien engineers work together to solve problems that had never existed before. The Dimensional Gateway project required technology from a dozen different species and techniques that violated most known laws of physics. Engineer Danny Clark led the technical team that built the gateway using a combination of human stubbornness and alien science. The massive structure formed a ring around one of Jupiter's moons and drew power from the gas giant's magnetic field to tear a hole between dimensions. The theory is sound, but we have no idea what we'll find on the other side, Danny explained to Admiral Hayes during the final systems check. These entities come from a realm where the rules might be completely different. Our ships might not even be able to function there. Admiral Hayes watched the gateway power up and knew that humanity was about to take the biggest gamble in its history. Danny, our species has a long tradition of going places we don't belong and making them work anyway. I have faith that human ingenuity will find a way. The first probe sent through the gateway transmitted data that made the human scientists question their understanding of reality itself. The entity's home dimension was a realm of pure energy where matter existed only as a temporary inconvenience. Space had no fixed distance, and time flowed in directions that shouldn't have been possible. General Patricia Wells watched the probe data and began planning military operations for a war that would be fought in impossible conditions. Human tactics would have to be completely reimagined for a battlefield where up and down were matters of opinion and cause and effect, operated according to alien logic. We'll need to weaponize our greatest advantage, General Wells told her staff. These entities evolved in a realm of pure logic and order. They consume civilizations by understanding them completely. But human behavior has never been completely logical or predictable. We're going to make ourselves into a virus in their perfect system. The human fleet gathered around the dimensional gateway while refugee ships from across the galaxy watched in amazement. The assembled vessels included everything from state-of-the-art military cruisers to converted cargo haulers armed with experimental weapons that might not work at all. Squadron leader Garcia tested his modified mining ships in dimensional space and discovered that human unpredictability was indeed a weapon. His vessels projected false energy signatures that confused the entity's hunting instincts while broadcasting everything from classical music to abstract art into the dimensional realm. The entities are trying to analyze our cultural transmissions, Garcia reported. They're drawn to the patterns in our music and art, but they can't understand the emotional content. It's like watching a computer try to feel love. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of New Horizon and addressed his crew before they entered the dimensional gateway. The faces looking back at him included humans, aliens, and some beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. After exposure to entity technology, we're about to enter a realm where everything we know about reality might be wrong, Morrison told them. But we're humans. And humans have a talent for making the impossible work. We've survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and our own stupidity. A few reality-bending monsters shouldn't be too much trouble. The fleet entered the dimensional gateway one ship at a time, while Admiral Hayes watched from Luna Base. Each vessel that crossed the threshold flickered out of normal space and disappeared into a realm that human science said couldn't exist. The gateway itself groaned under the strain of keeping a passage open between incompatible realities. Captain Carter's persistence led the advance force through the dimensional barrier and immediately found itself in a space where distance was measured in emotional states rather than physical units. The ship's navigation systems went insane trying to plot courses through a realm where the shortest distance between 2 points might be a feeling of nostalgia. Morrison, this place is completely insane, Carter transmitted through the dimensional link. My instruments show that we're simultaneously moving toward the enemy stronghold and away from it, depending on how optimistic my crew is feeling. Human psychology is apparently a navigation tool here. The entity's home dimension was filled with structures that existed in 17 different states simultaneously and creatures that fed on the concept of existence itself. The human fleet found itself fighting a war where weapons had to be aimed at abstract ideas rather than physical targets. Morrison's crew discovered that their captured entity was becoming more cooperative as they traveled deeper into its home realm. The creature seemed to respect their audacity in entering a dimension where they had no right to exist and began providing information about its species' weaknesses. They call themselves the Devourers, and they've consumed thousands of realities over millions of years. Rachel Stone translated from the entity's communications. But they've never encountered a species that fights back with chaos and unpredictability. They don't know how to process information that doesn't follow logical patterns. The human fleet spread through the entity dimension using tactics that would have been impossible in normal space. Ships moved by focusing on their intended destinations rather than plotting physical courses, while weapons were aimed by visualizing the destruction of abstract concepts. General Wells coordinated the assault from her command post that now existed partially in both dimensions. Her strategic planning had evolved to include factors like enemy morale and conceptual vulnerability alongside traditional military concerns like ammunition and fuel supplies. "We're not just fighting for human survival anymore," General Wells announced to her staff. "We're fighting to prove that chaos and free will can defeat order and predetermination. This is a war for the right to be unpredictable." The Devourers found themselves facing an enemy that broke all their rules for how civilizations should behave. Human ships attacked in patterns that made no logical sense, while human crews broadcast contradictory information that confused the entity's analytical processes. The final assault on the Devourer stronghold began with humanity doing what it did best, something completely unexpected. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of New Horizon and watched his fleet arrange itself in a formation that violated every principle of military strategy while somehow making perfect sense in the twisted logic of the entity dimension. The Devourer Fortress existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously and should have been impossible to attack with conventional weapons. But human engineers led by Danny Clark had discovered that impossibility was just another engineering challenge to overcome. They built reality anchors that forced local space to follow human rules rather than entity logic. Anchors deployed, Danny reported from his position in the ship's modified cargo bay. Local space is now operating under Earth normal physics. Gravity points down, energy follows conservation laws, and cause comes before effect. The entities in this area are going to hate us. Captain Carter's persistence phased in and out of visibility as it led the advance force toward the fortress. The experimental ship had become more than human technology, evolving into something that belonged partially in each dimension. Carter himself had begun to exist in multiple states simultaneously, which made him uniquely qualified to fight beings that refused to be bound by normal reality. "Morrison, I can see the fortress core." Carter transmitted through channels that existed in 17 dimensions at once. "It's beautiful and terrible and completely wrong. The structure feeds on the concept of existence itself. When we destroy it, we might unmake everything that has ever been." Morrison felt a chill of fear at Carter's words, but pushed it aside. Humanity had faced extinction before and always found a way to survive. They would find a way to destroy the fortress without destroying reality itself, even if it meant improvising solutions that no sane species would attempt. Admiral Hayes coordinated the attack from her command center that now existed simultaneously on Luna and in the entity dimension. The dual existence allowed her to direct operations in both realities while monitoring the effects of human actions on the fundamental structure of space and time. All units, commence the final assault, Admiral Hayes ordered. Remember, we're not just fighting for human survival. We're fighting for the right of every species in every dimension to exist without being consumed by something that thinks it knows better. The human fleet opened fire with weapons that shouldn't have worked, but did anyway through sheer force of human determination. Nuclear warheads were reconfigured to explode conceptually rather than physically, while energy weapons fired beams of pure stubbornness that cut through entity defenses like butter. Squadron leader Garcia led his mining ships in an attack pattern based on traditional human square dancing while broadcasting emotional resonance frequencies that confused the entity's logical processes. The Devourers found themselves unable to predict or counter movements that were based on folk traditions rather than military doctrine. The entities are retreating to deeper dimensional layers, Garcia reported, while his ship spun through impossible maneuvers. They can't process combat tactics based on barn dance patterns. Whatever analytical systems they use for warfare, they definitely didn't account for human cultural traditions. The Devourer fortress began to crack under the assault, as reality anchors forced its 17-dimensional structure to exist in only 3 dimensions at a time. The reduction in complexity made the fortress vulnerable to conventional weapons, and human crews poured firepower into weak points that only existed when viewed from a human perspective. Dr. Rachel Stone worked frantically to maintain communication with their captured entity while the fortress crumbled around them. The creature had become almost friendly during their journey through its home dimension and now seemed genuinely distressed at the destruction of its species' stronghold. "It's trying to warn us about something," Rachel told Morrison as she interpreted the entity's increasingly frantic communications. "There are older things in the deep dimensions that make the Devourers look like children. If we destroy the fortress completely, we might wake up something much worse." Morrison considered this warning while watching his fleet systematically dismantle a structure that had consumed countless civilizations over millions of years. The smart thing would be to pull back and find a way to contain the Devourers rather than risk awakening an even greater threat. But humanity had never been known for making smart decisions when survival was at stake. "All ships, modify your targeting to leave the fortress core intact," Morrison ordered. "We're going to capture their central command system instead of destroying it. If there are worse things out there, we'll need the Devourers' knowledge to fight them." Engineer Danny Clark began reconfiguring the reality anchors to create a containment field around the fortress core. The process required him to exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously while maintaining his human perspective, which would have driven most beings insane, but only gave Danny a mild headache. "Containment field is stable," Danny reported. "The fortress core is now trapped in a bubble of human normal space. Any entities inside will have to follow our rules if they want to interact with us." General Patricia Wells watched the tactical display show human forces establishing control over the Devourer stronghold and felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The campaign had required humanity to evolve beyond its original limitations while somehow remaining essentially human. "Begin Phase 2 of the operation," General Wells commanded. "Establish dimensional beacons around the fortress and prepare to drag the entire structure back to our reality. We're going to study this thing until we understand everything about interdimensional warfare." The process of moving a 17-dimensional fortress through a gateway designed for three-dimensional space required techniques that violated most known laws of physics. Human and alien engineers worked together to solve problems that had never existed before, while reality itself groaned under the strain. Captain Carter's persistence served as a guide ship during the transition, leading the captured fortress through dimensional barriers that tried to reject its existence. The experimental vessel had evolved beyond its original design and now existed as something between a ship and a living entity that belonged to multiple realities simultaneously. The fortress is through the gateway, Carter reported as the massive structure materialized in normal space near Jupiter. It's not happy about being forced into 3 dimensions, but the containment field is holding. We've successfully captured the central command system of a species that has been conquering dimensions for millions of years. Admiral Hayes watched the Devourer fortress settle into orbit around Jupiter like a captured moon and began planning the next phase of humanity's expansion into interdimensional space. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. The surviving Devourers found themselves prisoners in their own fortress, forced to exist in the limited 3-dimensional space that humans considered normal. Their vast intelligence was constrained by reality anchors that made logical analysis impossible and replaced it with the chaotic uncertainty that humans called free will. Ambassador Keth Var stood in the observation deck of the human refugee ship and watched the captured fortress spinning slowly in Jupiter's gravity well. The crystalline Zephyrian had lived through the destruction of his homeworld and the near extinction of his species, only to witness humanity accomplish something that should have been impossible. "Your species has achieved the ultimate victory," Keth Var told Admiral Hayes during their final meeting. "You have not just defeated the Devourers, you have converted them to your way of thinking. They are learning to be unpredictable and chaotic instead of logical and orderly." Admiral Hayes smiled as she looked out at the fortress that now served as both a prison and a research facility, where human and entity scientists worked together to understand the mysteries of interdimensional space. "Ambassador, the thing about humans is that we don't just want to win. We want to make friends out of our enemies and turn them into allies for the next impossible fight." The galaxy began to rebuild under human leadership with the understanding that paranoia and preparedness were not character flaws, but survival traits. Human colonies spread through space carrying dimensional detection equipment and early warning systems based on Amanda Foster's original research. Dr. Rachel Stone established the Interdimensional Studies Institute in the captured fortress and began training a new generation of scientists to monitor the deep dimensions for threats. The Institute's motto, carved into the main entrance in 17 languages, read simply, "Next time, listen to the humans." The Devourers who had once consumed entire civilizations now worked alongside their former prey to defend reality against threats from even deeper dimensions. They had learned that chaos and unpredictability were not weaknesses to be eliminated, but strengths to be celebrated. Captain Morrison retired from active duty but continued to serve as an advisor to the new Interdimensional Defense Force. He often told young officers that the secret to human success was not superior technology or tactical brilliance, but the simple refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable.